Our first speaker is David Turnley. He's associate professor of photography in the Residential College and the School of Art and Design here at the University of Michigan. He's a renowned photographer and filmmaker. He's received the Pulitzer Prize in Photography for his coverage of the revolutions of 1989, including the fall of the Berlin Wall and Tiananmen Square. He's twice been awarded the World Press Picture of the Year and the prestigious Robert Capa Award for Courage and 4 Overseas Press Club Awards. It's a great privilege to welcome him here to the Institute. It's also been a privilege to have the exhibit outside of this room that I hope you had a chance to look at those photos. They're obviously iconic, and as I told him when I first saw some of them, I recognized them from my younger days, and seeing them, I don't remember the publications, but I know that in my family, you know, the usual suspects, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, perhaps the New York Times. I mean, these have appeared, they've formed a sort of history of these eras and these moments. So discussing, or our discussant for this session, which will be briefer than the rest because we have a single discussant, is, again, Thomas Keenan, who spoke this morning. But for those who are just arriving, Keenan is associate professor in the Comparative Literature Department and director of the Human Rights Project at Bard College. And we want to, again, delighted that he's here from New York for this. So I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Ken, and it's an honor to be here today. I think probably many of you in this audience, if not all of you, are interested in things that I'm interested in. And when Ken asked me to come, I was absolutely proud to be amidst you today. I'm going to give you just a journey through my own photographic life and career. I'm 57 years old. I was raised in the industrial Midwest. My parents were both from humble backgrounds, but kind of amazing people in my estimation. My father went on to be an orthodontist, my mother a concert pianist, raised 4 kids. My growing up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, felt very loved. Our dinner table conversations were on a regular basis. My parents made a real point. So again, let me, before I go any further, if I'm 57, that means I was born in 55. It means I was 8 years old in 1963. Our dinner table, and I'll come back to that, our dinner table conversation, from the time I was as old as I can remember, was constantly invoking the awareness of human and civil rights, particularly as it pertained to the issue of race in our society. And Dr. King was a hero in my family's life. John F. Kennedy also represented a spirit, I think, that encompassed the country at the time, but certainly was a spirit that I felt in my family, and that was a sense that probably the best thing you can do is to make a civic contribution to your society and also to respect one another. When I was 8 years old, we got our 3rd grade class was halted at about, if I recall, it seems like it was sometime in mid-morning. I'm sure each of you, well, many of you, some of you are probably too young. I'm realizing I'm generationally challenged these days, but many of you can remember where you were when you were availed to the fact that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. I remember going home. It was dark. We sat in a room for 3 days and watched television. It was a very grieving time. I was thinking about it the other day. It was really the first time in my life that I understood the sensation of loss. No one else in my family had, no grandparents, no one close to us had died. But I distinctly remember the sensation for the first time in my life of really feeling a sense of loss. We watched on TV, and I wasn't really aware acutely at the time of the power of images, but we watched on TV. Again, this is 63. We still had black and white television, and many of you remember seeing Lyndon Johnson sworn in. You remember seeing Jack Ruby assassinate Lee Harvey Oswald live on TV. You saw John salute. And I think certainly from my vantage point, we all felt family to this young boy. And then forward to '68, and I was at a movie theater. I was 13 at the time with my 3 brothers and sisters, and my mother and father came and got us out of a movie theater. And they looked very shaken, and they took us home, and they told us that Dr. King had been assassinated. And they said they didn't bring us home because they were worried about us. They brought us home because they felt like a member of the family had been killed, and they wanted us to be together. And then a few months later, Bobby Kennedy was shot and assassinated. And then in '68 in Mexico City, 2 of the most revered athletes on the American Olympic team, 2 of the fastest human beings in the world, the kind of people that Americans celebrate after winning the gold and the bronze in the 200 meters, stood on a podium and raised their fists with black gloves, and America shook because America wasn't really accustomed to a manifestation of a black power statement, of a statement of militancy for civil rights. Cassius Clay, probably the most gifted athlete that ever lived, announced to the world that he didn't understand why we were killing people in Vietnam. What did we have to do with a fight in Vietnam? What did we know about yellow people in Asia? And that he could relate to that as a black man in America. And he converted to Islam and became Muhammad Ali and refused to go to Vietnam. Images from Vietnam were coming across the television and in news magazines and were shaking the American public's sense of bearings. We escalated the war in 1965. Johnson sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam. And these were the images that changed the public opinion against that war. We were allies with the South Vietnamese, and we see an image of a South Vietnamese corporal assassinating a man suspected of being a Viet Cong without any due process. And Americans, again, were thrown off balance. Our National Guard shot 4 people at Kent State. And I was back in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm sorry. Let's see here. Oh, this is always the worst fear of someone. Let's see what's happening here. I'm so sorry. Let's see if we can do it. Goodness. Hang on 1 second. See if this works. Well, we're going to have to look at them this way. I was back in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to be perfectly honest with you, a young man, aware of these things going on, thinking I was going to play pro football. I was actually pretty good at it. In fact, I came to the University of Michigan and played as a wide receiver my freshman year. I was a walk-on here, which was a big deal in 1973. I played under Bo Schembechler for a few minutes. And then one day, my twin brother was also a really good football player, tore up a knee in a football injury. And he was in the hospital, and my dad gave him a camera, and he gave him a book called The Family of Man. And the first thing my brother did with the time on his hand was go into the inner city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, which was a very segregated city, and start to photograph the lives of our black teammates, who we would probably every day say goodbye to as they got on a bus at about 6:30 after practice and go back to the inner city. And he started coming home with these photographs, and in these photographs, I remember just, if you had told me that I was going to be a photographer at that age, I would have told you you were crazy. I used to see these photographers on the sidelines of football games thinking, why don't you guys want to play? It's so sad, you're just standing there. And suddenly he comes home with these photographs, and I got knocked off my feet, because as we'd grown up hearing this message that we're all created equal, it never really made very much sense to me. Nothing was equal in my hometown. It was a black inner city, a white periphery, a poor inner city, more affluent suburban area. And suddenly what I'm seeing in my brother's photographs, that is, what is equal is dignity. And it just sort of knocked me off my feet. And I said, you know what, if I can use a camera to register that, that's what I want to do. And I sort of never looked back. Peter and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to show you these in a bigger way, but okay. We were also very aware of the idea that there were already at age 17, there were lots of people, not just people of color, but socioeconomic groups in this country that we felt were just dismissed. And we fell onto an inner city street, a working class street that was mostly white, Hispanic, Appalachian, and we spent 2 years photographing life on this one street from the age of 17 to 19. I finished the University of Michigan and then took a job photographing at a chain of rural newspapers. And I spent 2 years in my free time photographing an elderly farm couple that had been married for 60 years and who were subsistence farmers. And I was just fascinated by what it is to be in love. And I was thinking about human rights a few minutes ago before we started, and I was thinking, what do I share with you, the people in this room? You guys are all very different. I don't know any of you. I'm also not particularly objective about anything. The only thing I know is that the thing we share in common is that we all have a heart. We all seem to be breathing. I know we were all born, and I know we're all going to die. And I would guess that each of us has probably lost someone that we care about. And we all aspire to be loved and to love. That's kind of what we share. And that's what I've really tried to photograph around the world. I've worked in about 75 countries. These are photographs from this street in Fort Wayne. I was 17 after I just started photographing. I was down in the southern part of Indiana photographing a textile worker union strike. The factory in the southern part of Indiana was trying to break this union. My older brother was a leftist, and he was on the side of the strikers, and I'd gone down to photograph, and I'm really feeling sympathetic and warm and fuzzy towards these mostly little old lady factory workers who were showing a lot of might and striking, and I really believed in their strike. And suddenly this pickup truck drives by, and this gentleman hangs out a placard that says, "Come to the public KKK meeting on Saturday." And these same little ladies, who I'd really found really quite lovely, started screaming, "Henry, we'll be there." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh. And I decided I should go to the KKK rally, and I did. And it was an interesting experience. What I witnessed and listened to for a day of KKK speeches was effectively all sort of the same theme, which is that if you really listened hard, what you were hearing was that the people under these hoods were very concerned that black men and their virility were going to steal their white women. That was basically the common theme. These were the pictures I was telling you about, photographing the elderly farm couple for 2 years, Anna and Flander. I was interested in just what is it to be in love for 60 years of your life? And then I got a job working for the Detroit Free Press in 1980. I was a kid in a candy store. Having gone to school here, I knew that Detroit was one of the most fascinating cities in the world. It had every socioeconomic, racial, ethnic problem, challenge, urban challenge in the world. And when I was going to school here, it was really interesting to me in the 70s. I never saw people of color in the newspaper unless they had handcuffs on, unless they were criminals. And yet the city, by the time I was at work at the Free Press in 1980, was 90-some% black. So I spent 5 years of my life doing stories about people living in Detroit. In 1982, the city of Detroit, in a very challenged time, it was really the beginning of the downfall of the economic and the automobile industry in Detroit. They, in trying to keep General Motors from moving to another state to build a factory, they, through eminent domain, decided to move 6,000 people from a community known as Poletown, destroy the homes, and to build a Cadillac factory. And for 2 years, I thought when they did this, when they said this, I thought, here we go again. We're completely disregarding the importance of what community means. These were people who had come here looking for the American dream, mostly Polish, Czech, Slovak, had lived here since they were many of them in their 20s and 30s, gone to the same bar for 30 years, the same church. It was relatively integrated. The city thought that these people would just sort of quietly go away, and they didn't. They actually came together and they took over the church, and they refused to be displaced. This was the last day of this woman's sweeping out a store that she had run for 65 years. And these little old men and women again took over a Catholic church, and the police came in the middle of the night and extracted them and then bulldozed the church. And there went Poletown. Some incredibly high percentage of these people, because many of them were elderly, died within the first 6 months of being displaced. I went to Gaza in 1982. Working in Detroit, I became very conscious and aware of the Arab American community, and certainly the Palestinian community, since Detroit has a very large Arab community. And an American newspaper at that stage, there wasn't a single American newspaper in America that had ever done a project looking at the Palestinian diaspora, calling it a diaspora. So I went with 2 writers, and we traveled around the world to do the first project looking at the Palestinian diaspora. This was in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza in 1982, a woman bathing a child in the Mediterranean because there were no other washing facilities available. This was in Beirut during the Israeli siege of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Went to India in 1984 when Indira Gandhi was assassinated by Sikh bodyguards, which triggered a Sikh-Hindu kind of civil war. A young girl who was with her family living in a refugee camp, Sikhs who were seeking safety from attacks from Hindus. And then I went to South Africa in 1985. As we all know, apartheid was a system of a system to protect minority rule. In a country of 46 million, 6 million whom were white and 40 million whom were of color, it was a system that denied people of color any civil rights. Those were the broad brushstrokes. People knew that. People were outraged by that around the world. I was interested in what are the day-to-day indignities of that system. I didn't have an axe to grind, white or black. I felt that it was the system that was unjust, and I immersed myself in the unraveling of apartheid over the course of 5 years. It was pictures like this of this young man, I'm sort of not so young man actually, this gentleman, who is a laborer for the white gentleman, the white farmer in the Baki, forced to stand in the back even though the passenger seat was empty. These kinds of status quo, day-to-day moments that you saw everywhere in South Africa, that you sort of still do, to be honest, were the kind of moments I was interested in. And it was photographs like this, and this photograph of this 14-year-old girl cleaning lint off of the floor with this white farmer. These kinds of photographs were the photographs that absolutely outraged the South African government. The photographs of confrontations didn't seem to bother them. But these subtle realities totally upset them, because these were the day-to-day realities that they just were in denial about. I was actually kicked out of the country at the end of '88. I was the 11th journalist that year, which in those days was a big compliment, because it meant the government thought you were doing something. I became very close to the Mandela family, the daughters, Winnie. I was asked by Life magazine to spend several months photographing them and became a family friend. and was there when Nelson Mandela was released in February of 1990, and then went back to his prison cell on Robben Island, where he'd been held for 14 of his 27 years. I've been photographing Madiba since his release in 1990 until now, and did a book called Mandela in Times of Struggle and Triumph. The first time this gentleman who's blind had ever voted in a free election in South Africa. And in 1989, as we all know, every time Gorbachev left the Soviet Union and visited a country, it basically toppled within the next several weeks. And one of those countries that didn't topple, but certainly endured a revolution with 2 million students taking over Tiananmen Square, was China in Beijing. This was on the afternoon of June 3rd when the Chinese troops had come into Tiananmen Square, and this mother of one of the students on the square is begging these troops to understand that these are their brothers and sisters and cousins and uncles, and that they shouldn't that they should join in solidarity of the pro-democracy movement. Flew to Berlin in 1989, the day that the Berlin Wall opened. In 1991, when the United States government, after Saddam Hussein had entered Kuwait, as we all know, sent, I think, 500,000 troops to Iraq, and after the power of photographs to have changed public opinion in the Vietnam War, they decided they'd spent actually in Grenada, Panama. They'd gotten ready for something like this. They'd gotten ready to how to actually market war, and they obliged all photojournalists now to be associated by what they call a public affairs officer, and the explicit guidelines and sort of contract that anyone that was in one of these pools had to make as a visual photographer or cameraman was that you wouldn't be allowed to photograph casualties, and certainly not people who had been killed, unless it had been okayed by the public affairs officer. I was with the 82nd Airborne, which was the furthest most unit of the American Army, who was going to be the first dropped into Iraq on the beginning of the war, the day the war would begin, in a night mission with parachutes. The public affairs officer was actually a great guy from Kentucky, and he said that we sat together around fires for about a month in the middle of the desert. And he said, "Dave, you're crazy. When the war starts, we're going to drop in parachutes, and I'm not going to let you photograph. You're not going to use a flash, and if there are any casualties or wounded, you're not photographing." That's what I've been told, and it's not that I don't like you, but that's my duty. And I realized this is ridiculous. I'm cannon fodder, number one. Number two, I can't work. And I discovered this MASH unit, this elite MASH unit down the road. And I suddenly realized that the MASH unit, they had put together this cream of the cream of the American Armed Forces MASH team that could create an operating room, emergency operating room tent anywhere on the battlefield in about 15 minutes. And the idea was that they would do that, and they would be deployed to take care of people that couldn't withstand being evacuated into more rear sort of medic facilities. And I thought, well, here's a team that actually is doing something that I believe in, number one. Number two, it's going to give me access to the theater of war. So I went AWOL from the 82nd Airborne. It's a long story, and I got back to a rear base and hired a four-wheel drive and drove another 20 hours into the desert back to this MASH unit, went to the public affairs officer, and I said, "I'd like to join your unit and document what you do." And I said, "I don't actually believe in this war, but I think what you're doing is necessary." And he said, "You know what, you're the first honest man I've met in a long time, but we don't have a public affairs officer." And I said, "Well, it's not a problem for me if it's not a problem for you." And he says, "Great, do you want to sleep with the doctors or the nurses?" And I chose the doctors and stayed with this unit then for several weeks, which put me in a position on the last day of the war. None of us knew it would be the last day of the war, but at about 5 in the morning, the man who was the captain of the helicopter evacuation team woke me up and said, "Come fly evacuation missions with me today." And we did, and at about 11 o'clock, we'd done some sort of what seemed to be kind of routine missions, and then all of a sudden a radio transmission came over, and you could see the consternation on his face. Something else was up on this one, and he took the stick. He'd actually been co-piloting, and we flew deep into Iraq near Nasiriyah and along the Tigris River. And as we descended, you could see 3 tanks and lots of smoke Clearly, these tanks had all been hit by some sort of armament. We touched down. There was a team of guys that had been spooned out the back of this Bradley fighting vehicle. It had been split in two by a missile. And everything went into slow motion. I could see what was about to happen. They loaded the gentleman on the left, Ken Kazakowicz, and the gentleman on the right, in the middle rather, Mike Sankarisas, into the helicopter, and went back to retrieve the body of the gentleman in the body bag who had actually been the driver of the Bradley, who'd been split in two, and they put the two body parts in the body bag. And one of the medics took off the dog tags and put them in his pocket, and as he loaded the body bag into the helicopter and as we took off, the medic on the right suddenly passed the dog tags across the gentleman, Ken, on the left, and it was at that moment that he realized that his best friend was in that body bag. And this photograph, when I made the picture, I knew it was a powerful image, and my motivation was that I wanted people to know that whatever your political position about a war is, you've got to know that people die. People risk their lives. It wasn't a video game, as CNN was making it out. The Pentagon had really figured out how to make us all think that we were just watching video games with these smart bombs that hit these targets with no collateral damage, no soldiers. It was actually one of these wars that America did much better than they thought they would. I think we lost, what, a couple dozen people, actually. But I wanted people to be reminded it doesn't matter what side of a war you're on, there's a huge sacrifice. And so I nevertheless was in the middle of the desert and had to figure out how to get this film back. And my worst fear was that if I sent it with a military courier, that they would discover what was in the images and that they would actually deep six it. And that when I would get back, and I didn't know how I'd ever get back, it seemed that it would take me perhaps days, and I didn't know it was the last day of the war. But I really had no choice because I wanted people to see this image. I packed a caption deep under like 5 layers of envelopes with cryptic information for the editors that were back at this rear base, and sent it with a military courier. We then discovered that the war was actually over, and I got into a 4-wheel drive and drove down the highway from Baghdad to Kuwait. It was the first civilian driving down that highway as the Iraqi army was actually retreating. Went through Kuwait and then drove all night back to Dhahran. By now it had been 48 hours, and as I got back at about 4 in the morning, I went to the edit room where the international pool editors were transmitting photographs. And as I arrived, and I was filthy. I'd been in the desert for several months by then. I walk in, and this editor said, "Oh, Turnley, we haven't gotten any of your film." And I thought, oh, it's my worst fear. So I'd go to the desk of the Department of Defense, and before I'd gone out in the field, I'd gotten to know this gentleman. He was actually a really good guy. He'd been in Vietnam. I said, "Larry, where's my film?" He said, "Oh, Turnley." He says, "Yeah, we got your package, and we went in, and we saw the captions, and we realized that there were wounded. And you know the drill, that it takes 48 hours to notify the next of kin." And I said, "Larry, it's been 48 hours. I said, "And you've been in Vietnam. If you don't release these photographs, you're denying these young men their due right to not to necessarily just be heroes, but just that the world knows the sacrifice you make when you go to war." And he says, "I take your point after being in Nam. I'll give you the film, but don't transmit it until I come back and let you know what to do." So we go back, they process the film. Nobody really knows what's on the film. And in those days, it was the beginning of the digital age. And it's really interesting to tell you this. My life for many years was processing film in bathrooms with toilet water, where there wasn't any water. And then trying to find a telephone that I would have to undo and with alligator clips connect a transmitter if I was lucky. And then it would take, if I could get a clean phone line for 45 minutes, I could transmit one photograph. That was my life for many, many years. Suddenly we're in the digital age, and we have a computer screen, and they scan. We see this frame, they scan it, it suddenly comes up. Sort of the whole room comes over and looks at it. And they looked at me and they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Hit the button," meaning transmit it. And it went out, it was in every paper, on the front page of every paper in the world, and double page in every magazine. I went and slept for 2 days. I hadn't slept for a really long time. And came back 2 days later, and I came into the edit room, and they said, all these editors were kind of proud and smiling. They said the Pentagon came running in, freaking out, had this photograph get on the front of the New York Times, and we all just sort of hunched our shoulders. 2 weeks later, after the war had actually gone so well, the Pentagon loved this photograph because suddenly it did make soldiers heroes again. How's our time, Ken? Okay. In 1994, I went to Somalia to cover the civil war, in which, again, food was being used as an armament of war. Tens of thousands of people died simply because they had no food to eat. In Rwanda, after 500,000 Tutsis were killed by Hutus, I went to Rwanda. And subsequent to that, as all of you know, many of you know, another 500,000 people were refuged on top of volcanic rock on the edge of Rwandan Zaire near Goma. And just about as many people died of cholera, simply because they didn't have pure water. This is a young boy whose father was one of the 500,000 people who died of cholera. This is a tough photograph to make. And I stood there. And you have to understand, this was in the midst of thousands of people dying. It was apocalyptic beyond anything I could ever describe to you. I stood there not knowing what to do. There's a series of photographs that aren't here today that I made. A few minutes later, most of the people along this road that you see to the back are sort of straggling down the road, barely stand up. And suddenly this gentleman sort of pops up, and he's very energetic and kind of looks okay, and walks over and picks up this young boy. And my heart started palpitating, and I got so excited wondering what's going to happen with this young boy. And I followed him down the road about 2 miles, and he turned inland into the bush and arrived at this sort of gathering of rondavels, and 11 children poured out, and the wife, and they all kind of smiled, and she went back in the rondavel and came out with this bowl of mealie meal, cornmeal, and sat the child down on her lap and started to feed him. And I went in French, went to the gentleman, I said, I just have to know, what are you going to do with this child? And he says, nous avons 11 enfants hier, nous aurions aujourd'hui 12 enfants. So we had 11 children yesterday, we'll have 12 now. Went to Bosnia from 92 to 96. Hellacious war, as you all know. And my role as a photojournalist became very difficult because I didn't want to desensitize people. It was hard to know who were the good guys and the bad guys. I don't even think there was such a thing. It was a nationalistic war. The glue came undone when Tito left, kind of an artificial state. And suddenly all, as you know, these legacies of these historical and animosities and hatred surfaced. And the only way that I understood to actually make a contribution was to do a project around refugees, non-specific to ethnic group, because I felt like it was the civilians in the war in Yugoslavia that were the victims. This woman had actually been one of the women who, after, and I don't know, and I think that you would know the number. How many people were killed in Srebrenica? So she was one of the women from that village, and she'd just been displaced by the Serbian army and left on the side of the road. And about 2 weeks later, a Time magazine reporter came to me at a hotel, and actually we were in Mostar, and said, I got one of the only interviews that's taken place during this war with Mladic at a bunker. Do you want to come and photograph? And I said, sure. And apparently, actually, a CNN crew with Bill Delaney, who was the correspondent, had also gotten an interview. My thought was, I want to go to Srebrenica and Zepa. I want to photograph what happened there. So if I can go and meet Mladic and do anything I can during access, I've got to give this a try. Well, I knew Bill Delaney and the CNN crew, and they went in before the Time magazine reporter. And it was interesting. Eastern Europeans, this is my experience, a handshake's really important. Looking in the eye is really important. I walked in. Bill Delaney invited me in with the CNN crew before the Time magazine reporter, so I'd already been in the room for about an hour. And Delaney had handled the interview pretty well. He realized that in trying to reach his agenda, which was to get as much information as he could, he needed to first sort of ask some questions that didn't immediately polarize Mladic. So he went around things, and actually he did really well. And Mladic was totally disarmed. And he, at that point in the war, I think, and his cronies, there were 3 other generals in the room, they had obviously become the pariahs of the world, and they needed some sense of validation. And just the presence of this CNN crew somehow did that for them. And then they left, and there was an interim, and they brought out cognac, and they passed it around. And then the Time magazine reporter came in, and I'm thinking, this is going really well. If he plays his cards right, we might actually get some cooperation. This is perhaps naive of me, but that was my agenda. And Mladic immediately stuck out his hand to shake the hand of the Time magazine reporter. Time magazine reporter would not shake his hand. It was really awkward. There was one of those moments, actually went on for, it felt like about 3 minutes. He's got his hand there, which is, I'm not telling you how any of you should feel. I'm just giving you descriptive details of what happened. And finally, the Time magazine sort of took this part of his hand and shook it, which is kind of even worse. And at that point, Mladic just shut down, just totally shut down. The interview just was horrible. And we got outside, and I remember the Time magazine reporter looking at me in the car and said, "Wow, you were in there for a long time." I said, "Yeah, I was." I said, "I was in there for a long time because this is the first time he's had the opportunity to photograph somebody who was responsible for a genocide. And I think it's important to know who he is and get as much information about this man as possible. And by shaking his hand, I'm not a jury. I didn't give him approbation. I'm not the jury in my role here. I'm making photographs, and access was more important to what I might actually discover about what's going on in this war than whether or not my hand touched his hand." And that was my position. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that was my own view of things. It was very disarming to be around him. A Muslim couple being married on the front line in Sarajevo. I think we're running out of time. I'm going to go through some photographs really quickly. The Dalai Lama at 3 in the morning. I lived with him for a week in northern India. He meditates 8 hours a day from 3 in the morning. Soviet Union in 91 when it toppled. Cuba, 2001. One of the least changed rural areas in Europe, in a place called Maramureas in Romania. The civil war in Northern Ireland, the sectarian war between Catholics and Protestants. Afghanistan when the Taliban took over in 96. Chechnya, 96. I was in New York on 9/11, went in with the first firemen, was right under the 2 towers when they came down. Went down to the Deep South 3 years ago to do a story about the Deep South 40 years after the Civil Rights Movement. And in 2008, I spent several days on the campaign photographing President Obama, trying to get him elected. And that's the end of my presentation. Should we sit down? Okay.
So thanks. I'm sure I speak for everybody.
You turn that on.
So I'm sure I speak for everybody in saying thank you for these amazing pictures.
It's not on.
Is it working now?
Hello,
Okay.
hello.
So I wanted to just ask you about a couple of the photographs rather than to speak generally about photography or photography and human rights.
Can I just interrupt? I urge all of you to ask any questions that you have on your mind, and don't censor yourself. I'm available for anything. And I talked a lot, and it was sort of I'm sorry. I don't know if it's on, actually. Maybe it is. Okay. Yeah, please, I just urge you all to ask anything on your minds.
So I wanted to know more about the KKK photograph.
Uh-huh.
First of all, because I think there's a long tradition in human rights photography of taking photographs of victims, and not such a robust tradition of taking pictures of perpetrators or of the responsible actors. So I was interested in the Mladic picture and in the KKK picture in particular, and maybe also in the Northern Ireland soldier picture. And the story you told about the genesis of the Klan picture was so interesting because it's not a story which is there in the picture by itself, right? So we see the Klan guy in a picture which seems really interestingly symbolic. It's got trees in the background, and the KKK and trees always sends you in a particular interpretive direction. The notion that that he would expose himself as much as he did, make himself available for the photograph, says something about his, I don't know what, ability to perform a role, confidence in what he was doing, shamelessness, et cetera, which also goes against a certain tradition in thinking about human rights photography, that it exposes the misdeeds of people who don't want their misdeeds exposed. But then when you told the story, it felt to me like we really desperately needed that other picture. We needed the picture of the women who had sent you to the KKK guy, because it changes the story radically, and it flips the narrative so amazingly. So I was, you could have the picture of the striking workers, and that, there's a code for reading that sends you down one road, and there's a picture of a KKK guy, and that sends you down another road, and you tell us that they're somehow the same, or that one led to the other. That I thought was so. There's a.
Can I do something quickly, actually, that would be interesting? Mm-hmm. I'm going to show you, because it's totally apropos to what you just asked me. Okay. I just did a film. I'm going to show you a 1.5-minute trailer. And this trailer is going to speak to what you're talking about. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then I'll take your question, but I think it'll be more interesting for the audience if I show you this before I get at it.
The phone rang. 10 after 9. And that's when our lives changed.
911, we need an ambulance immediately. What's the problem? I don't know. There's a man down in the middle of the street. My friend, I think he's going to come. You have to come here. I need an ambulance right now. 5 Street, Shenandoah.
What was going on there?
Somebody, you have. Someone keeps in his face. I know the names and everything. You have to come here.
A federal grand jury has indicted 6 people from Shenandoah.
4 Shenandoah police officers and 2 teenagers linked by the beating death of an illegal immigrant are now tied to an alleged cover-up.
No one should get away with murder, and that's what it was, murder.
The feeling is, I have to say, is emptiness, because I didn't even care. I didn't even worry about him at that time.
I was right from the start. That's my comment.
We can't stop coming together because of fear.
No, I don't think he deserved to die. Luis Ramirez would have been alive today had he stayed in his own country.
If it wasn't for this, I don't think anything would have been done. I think it would have just been pushed under the rug.
I started to think about Luis as a person.
I don't try to understand.
He has family, he has kids. I started to think about myself, and I put myself in that. What would my mom and my whole family and everybody do if it was me?
For tonight I need a friend, and it's sad to be young. Help me make it through the night.
That was great, Charlie.
So this is a film that I made in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, that I landed in 4 years ago, serendipitously the weekend that 4 young high school football players beat to death Luis Ramirez, an undocumented Mexican immigrant. And I earned access over the course of this 4 years into the lives of many of the people in this community to tell this story. Did you want to ask some more before I go on? So in 2 things immediately come to mind in answer to your question. I'm proud to tell you, and it's sort of neither here nor there, but just sort of an anecdote that at this point, the 35 years of photographing, maybe a little bit more actually, 40 I guess. I was 17 when I made the Ku Klux Klan pictures. I rushed back to Fort Wayne, Indiana in my car. I was so excited by these images. It was for me, a very frightening day, as you can imagine. I didn't know whether I was going to be followed at the end of the day. But I thought it was important. My point of departure, I gave you a little bit about a sense of my background. My point of departure has always been a sensation of trying to move beyond us and them. So I'm trying to understand people. I'm not apologizing for them, ever. In fact, I use my camera as my weapon. I want you to see what's going on. But I'm neither trying to demonize any particular group. I've never thought that any particular group was genetically, I don't believe in the word evil, but I don't believe any particular group is genetically configured in such a way. I think we all have a dark side and a light side. And I'm trying to figure out what goes wrong. When I drove back when I was 17, it was the only time in my entire career I went down to the basement at 3 in the morning to process these 11 rolls of film, and I didn't put the lid on the developer, and I destroyed all but 2 rolls of the film. So the photographs of the women were in the other 9 rolls. But all of that also to say that one of my evolutions is now making also films in trying to also bring other layers of narrative to the storytelling.
Should we just open it up?
Do you want to say more, or do you want to?
I could talk for hours, so let's just.
Well, yeah, let's open it up, because we have about 10 minutes. So does anyone want to ask questions of either person?
Yes, Peter.
Can you need to speak into a microphone.
You want
That's
this
the
mic?
rule.
Oh, there we go. This one's on.
This one's on. David, you briefly mentioned your rules of photojournalism. Why don't you speak a little bit to that? I'm very interested in that. This isn't necessarily a set of rules that every photojournalist has. It's your own personal take
That's
on
interesting.
how you
So,
are involved.
when I was working in Detroit in 80 to 85, and I've always told people, and I now teach, and I'm proud, and a couple of my wonderful colleagues are here today, Carol Jacobson and Joanne Leonard, who teach with me at the, or I teach with them at the School of Art and Design, and they're extraordinary. And as I'm teaching now, I always say to people, particularly when we're talking about war zones, that I actually learned how to work in war zones in Detroit. And I say that with affection. I don't say that disparagingly. But one of the tenets of that, or one of the components of that I learned, is something that I'm going to sound like a preacher when I talk about this, and so I apologize in advance. I'm trying to learn how to talk about my own experiences and not preach at people, but you have to learn how to do that when you teach. But I would go into 5 or 6 different people's lives on any given day over the course of 5 years in Detroit, and usually with a white reporter, because in those days, I think there was one journalist of color at the Detroit Free Press. And we were almost always going into the lives of people of color. And what I noticed was that something happened that I've come to experience in every culture around the world, that there's sort of a couple basic things that kind of happen. When you arrive at someone's doorsteps, the first thing that happens is you're greeted. And I would watch how different reporters would handle that process. In some cases, they either were themselves sort of filled with a bit of angst and nervousness, and so when the person who greeted us, who had known we were coming, opened their door and extended their hand, they would sort of tentatively extend their hand and oftentimes forget to even tell the person, the reporter's name. On the other hand, I would experience on the rare occasion a reporter who would look at the person in the eye, shake their hand, introduce themselves. The next thing would happen is that we would be invited into the house, and we would always be led to a room with a couch or a seat, and we would be asked to sit down. And then again, I would watch how this played out in a couple of different ways. Oftentimes the same person, again, for whatever their reason, I won't presume. I think it runs a range of, just sort of the unfamiliar to a sense of angst, sometimes maybe entitled, I don't know. But on one occasion, you would see someone who sort of sit on the edge of the couch. They wouldn't actually get back and be comfortable. And you could immediately see in the host's eyes that they realized that the person wasn't comfortable. At best, they realized that the person wasn't comfortable. At worst, they thought they didn't want to get dirty on their couch. And the next thing that would happen is, and this has happened in every culture in the world I've ever been in, the host would offer us something to drink. I've experienced that in every culture in the world. And again, sometimes the person in angst would say no, thank you, and the host would feel, oh, they don't want to drink our water because they're afraid the water's not going to be clean or something. Those are the basic things I've learned in my tenets of photojournalism, that in every human being I meet, I try to look them in the eye, shake their hand, introduce myself, sit comfortably in their chair, and drink their water.
Absolutely. Yes. Can you?
I want to, yes, have my I just wanted to make a comment, if I may, in response to what you were saying about not having the backdrop to his photo, and I understand there's a difference in what I'm saying, but I have heard the story, the background, and I have heard it more than once. And of course, I'm a bit aged, but so it is out there. So people are talking about that background, and in different contexts, it's brought up, this idea of how this seemingly interesting photo and these older ladies, just for comment.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. I'm interested, David and Thomas, in maybe how you might dialogue, given what Thomas was saying earlier, about the dissonance between projects that are engaged with gathering evidence and projects engaged with judgment, because you are a sort of evidence gatherer, but you said that you're not a jury, and that's why you would shake a genocidal agent's hand. And there seems to be a dissonance.
I had an objective.
Right, you had an objective. At the same time, this is really interesting to me, given this discourse of human rights, the field of human rights. And I guess sort of a corollary to that question is, David, how do you understand the relationship between your work as a photographer and human rights?
Right.
Because it seems to me, especially with how you answered that gentleman's Peter's question just now, that there's an accordance of humanity and human being to those individuals or agents that the discourse of human rights is not necessarily interested in talking about as human, which are the perpetrators. So there's a lot there, but
I think to some extent it is a case-by-case situation, and I'm very clear of, I try to be very clear of my objective. It's interesting. I'm not an expert when it comes to how and why people go off how their wheels go off the track, and they do horrible things. I have some sense of it. In Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, you can feel very distinctly a variety of things going on, and Mexicans, in sort of a quick summary, become scapegoats for a lot of self-loathing and frustration. And I'm sure that's true in a lot of places. I think my point of departure is that I aspire to connect and respect one another's dignity and respect our differences. I feel like so often we get inculcated in these, obviously these divisive dynamics. We see them in our own families. I mean, everyone in this room has a family member you've had a fight with. You've witnessed in all of your families something just go off the rails where somebody won't talk to somebody. That's like the most microcosmic, minuscule aspect of what then inflates. And but in apartheid's case, for example, I felt like the system was absolutely, and I never know the proper word, unjust. And I used my camera as a tool to indict apartheid. I didn't have an axe to grind about white people. I didn't have an extra ground about black people. I felt that everybody was a victim. My agenda was a human agenda, but I wanted you to see the subtle, day-to-day, pervasive indignations and humiliations and emasculations, and whatever the contrary of that is. What is the contrary of emasculation? What's the feminine verb for emasculation? Whatever that is. I wanted you to see that, and I wanted you to. And sometimes I want people to see what they don't see. In this case, the white farmer didn't have a clue what I was photographing. It was so much a part and parcel of what he grew up around. Didn't even pay attention to it. Would be totally flabbergasted why I would even if he saw that photograph, it would be a mystery to him why that was interesting to me.
Thank you.
One more.
Hello? Yes. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really brilliant. I have a question, and I don't know if this could be a concern, but I was just wondering, the general tendency of seeing a genocide is for a human being not to essentially be afraid of asking the perpetrators the general questions that you ask, which is amazing. Something that I would be incapable of doing. Do you ever feel that you're you may be in a place of privilege to be able to counter that that inability and be able to ask the perpetrators the questions that you are able to do? Because the general tendency is for a lot of people to walk that line is to be afraid of it, because like you said, even though we in our personal families we have encountered these conflicts, but for some reason we can never quite understand the reason for genocide, or even fathom the reasons why that would happen, or make it human enough. So I'm just wondering what would be your take on that.
Thank you for the question, and I certainly don't disavow the potential of privilege in probably a whole variety of forms. I'm not sure how that necessarily is at play specifically. I think that a number of things, fear is a powerful force, and fear seems to be at the heart of most antagonism. And I try to confront my own fear. I get excited by talking about the elephant in the room. And it's interesting, most people want to talk about the elephant in the room, actually. It's interesting, you talk to people, I was in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, this young man that you just saw in this film, who's in the film, one of the central characters, he participated in killing a man. And when you look someone in the eyes who's killed somebody, I'm not apologizing for him, I'm not dismissing it. I'm recognizing that this is what he did. And I want to hear what he has to say about it. And he actually, interestingly, had a need to talk about it. The one thing I do in that particular case, and I felt this, I'm not sure I would feel this in every case, so again, maybe specific, but I think I felt okay to say at that point when we sat down, I don't judge anybody by their one worst act. I want to know what happened. Now, that may not be true always. I may change my mind on that in some cases. I wouldn't have said that to Mladic. In his case, he was 17, and I had a sense of him. I had a sense of a contextualization of who he was. And I thought that he had an opportunity, after having done something heinous and inexcusable and unforgivable, he had an opportunity to actually maybe change some people's lives and bring about some awareness that went beyond the polarization of us and them, I'm trying to always explore, the potential for all of us to do some pretty lousy stuff. Because I think we all have the potential to do some pretty amazing stuff.
Okay, one more question.
This is just to round out the session before we move on to the next. In what ways do you see your role as photographer being analogous to that of a translator?
It's really interesting. When we were speaking in the beginning, he brought up the word translation. I remembered Ken speaking to me in the beginning about coming here to speak about evidence and translation. Is that the title? And I remember sort of cringing to Ken and saying, well, gosh, I've got to issue a disclaimer. I certainly don't gather quantifiable information. I respect you that does, and I'm so happy to be in this group. I mean, I think we all kind of care about the same things, actually. Translation. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I did high school French. This is sort of an aside. I was horrible. It was like, why would I learn how to speak French in Indiana? And then when I came to the University of Michigan, I'd worked construction and I'd made enough money. I dropped out of school for a year and lived in Paris. And suddenly I needed to eat and flirt, and I actually learned how to speak really well, and I have a degree in French literature. So I got really good at something that I thought I had no talents in, photography. I thought would never have occurred to me to be a photographer. And then when I saw what the tool of a camera is in terms of recording the, sort of the universal human dignity that each of us has, you can't buy dignity, and nobody can take that away from anybody. And I figured out I could use a camera to show that. So I suppose that's I don't know how that intersects necessarily with translation. It translates certainly my aspiration.
Translate their stories.
Their stories.
Not just recording either.
I've never thought of myself as objective. I try to be fair, but I don't know what it means to be objective.
Okay. It's hard to call this session to a close, but I have to. I want to thank David and Thomas for this. That's great.